So welcome back, everyone, to the sixth session. We're now halfway through, which is really exciting. So this week we're going to be talking about our third observational study design, which is a cross-sectional study. And to illustrate a cross-sectional study, I sent everyone an article to read, which is The Effect of Geography and Geographical Access on Under 5 Mortality. So what is a cross-sectional study? When I say the word cross-sectional study, the easiest way that I can explain it is it's like taking a snapshot. So we're not following a group over time, or we're not identifying a group and looking at them previously. We're taking a picture of the population at one point in time. So we may ask them things in the past, but we're really taking a snapshot of the population at one point in time. This also falls in the realm of observational studies. So I am not changing what happens to people. I'm not telling someone as part of the study, you are going to be doing this. I am just observing what happens naturally. So it is one of our three observational studies where we're just observing what naturally happens in the population. And this can be used for three things. One is to look at prevalence or incidence of either outcomes or exposures. Another is to look at relationships between certain exposures and certain outcomes. And then the third is to generate some ideas of what we think might be areas that we want to study further. So we call that hypothesis generation, where we might see some relationships in our study that we want to explore more or we want to study more. So cross-sectional studies are very good at generating these new ideas or new questions that we want to study further, giving us ideas and hypotheses that we want to study in the future. So a cross-sectional study is an observational study. It is the third of three observational study designs. We're just looking at what happens. We're not telling people or randomizing people to interventions. What are the two other observational studies that we have talked about so far? So we have cross-sectional studies today, cohort studies from 2 weeks ago, and case control studies. So they're all three different observational studies. We're not telling people what they're going to be doing. We're not changing what happens to people. We're just observing what happens to them. And all three of them are study designs that we can use. So I'm going to compare the cross-sectional study design to the other two that we've talked about. So this is going to be a bit of review. Who can describe for us what a cohort study is? So we identify a group of people and we follow them over a length of time and see what their outcomes are. Right? So that's a cohort study. And generally with cohort studies, or not generally, but oftentimes with cohort studies, we'll have two different groups. We'll have an exposed group and an unexposed group. And I follow them and I look at who has the outcomes in the exposed group, who has the outcomes in the unexposed group, and I try to see if there is some relationship between the exposure and the outcome. So for cohort studies, I identify them based on the exposure, and then I look at who has the outcome and is it different between those who are exposed and those who are unexposed. Case control study. Who can remind us what is a case control study? So I have my cases. They have the disease of interest or the outcome of interest, and then my controls who have no disease. So for the case control study, they already have either the outcome or don't have the outcome, and then I look back in these groups and I say, what was their exposure? So previously, in those who have the disease, who was exposed and who was not exposed? And in those who do not have disease, who was exposed and who was not exposed? And I try to see if exposure is different between those who are cases and those who are controls. So is there a difference in exposure between those who have disease and those who do not have disease. So I'm looking at relationships between exposure and outcome. So then how is a cross-sectional study different? For a cross-sectional study, in one point in time, I go in and I take my population, my study group. So at one point in time, I select a group, and in that group, some of them will be exposed, and some of them will be unexposed. So I take a group, some are male and some are female. Some are young and some are old. Some live near and some live far. At the same time, some of them have the outcome and some of them do not have the outcome. So I take my group, some have disease and some do not have disease. So for cohort studies, I was selecting on exposure. For case control studies, I was selecting on outcome. And for cross-sectional studies, I just take people. Some are exposed, some are not. Some are diseased, and some are not. But my question is still the same, which is, in this population, what is the relationship between exposure and outcome? So I'm still asking the same question. What is the relationship between exposure and outcome? But I am not choosing people based on exposure, and I am not choosing people based on outcomes. So you should already be thinking about why we might use a cross-sectional study versus case control or cohort studies, and what limitations a cross-sectional study might have compared to case control studies and cohort studies. So let's think about case control studies. Are case control studies appropriate if we have a rare exposure or a rare outcome? Do we prefer a case control study if we have a rare exposure or a rare outcome? A rare outcome. So if something is very, very rare, we would want to use a case control study because we could find as many people as possible with that group and put them together and then see what their exposures were. If we just by chance hope to find the people, we will not find them. But if we identify them and make them part of our study, not by chance, but because we did it on purpose, then we can find them. What about a cohort study? Is a cohort study good for a rare exposure or a rare outcome? A rare exposure. So if something does not happen very often, I don't want to just do a random sample and hope that I find enough people with the exposure. Instead, I would try to find as many people who are exposed and put them in a group and then follow them to see what happens to them later on. So if case control studies are good for rare outcomes and cohort studies are good for rare exposures, what do you think a cross-sectional study is good for? Rare exposures, rare outcomes, or neither? If I have a rare outcome, I will prefer to use a case control study. If I have a rare exposure, I will prefer to use a cohort study. And if I don't have either, then maybe I can use a cross-sectional study. Okay, cross-sectional studies are not good for rare outcomes or rare exposures. Now, one thing I do want you to be careful of that's particularly true with cross-sectional studies is at that point in time, I know they have the exposure, yes, no. And I know if they have the outcome, yes, no. But I generally do not know which one came first, right? I don't know if it was the outcome or the exposure. So an example is I can come to you and I can say, what is your BMI? And then I can classify you as overweight, regular weight, or underweight. And then I can say to you, do you watch 20 hours of TV a week? And you can say, yes, I do, or no, I don't. And maybe I want to say, does watching TV cause you to be overweight? The problem is, I don't know if you watch that much TV because you are overweight, or if you are overweight because you watch that much TV. All I know is you watch a lot of TV and that you are overweight. I don't know which one is first and which one is second, because I'm asking at one point in time. So with cross-sectional studies, we can never say that something causes something else. I cannot say watching TV causes you to be overweight. I can't say that being overweight causes you to watch TV. All I can say is that there is a relationship, so that watching TV is associated with being overweight, but I don't know which causes which. So in terms of advantages of cross-sectional studies, one advantage is the time. It's generally less time because we are not following the population. We're just looking at one point. Another advantage is you can look at many risk factors and many outcomes. So the demographic health surveys. Right now, I am involved in 5 different studies using that same cross-sectional study. So you can look at many, many things, many different outcomes with a cross-sectional study. Alternatively, you can look at many exposures. So that's one of the biggest benefits of a cross-sectional study, is you can look at many exposures and you can look at many outcomes with the same data. It's often used to compare populations. So I might do a cross-sectional study here and a cross-sectional study in Kigali and compare the characteristics that are the same and different between the groups. And like all of the observational studies, they're really intended to generate new ideas. What do I want to explore more? So it's good for giving new ideas of things you want to study in the future. Disadvantages: it is not good for rare outcomes, and it is not good for rare exposures. If you have a rare outcome, use a case control study. If you have a rare exposure, use a cohort study. You cannot use a cross-sectional study in those cases. There's all kinds of biases. There's recall bias. So if I go and ask a woman about whether or not she had 4 ANC visits and when did she have them, she may not be able to remember when she sought care. There is survival bias, which is a type of selection bias. If you have already died before I do my study, you're not going to be included. So if I'm interested in, what are the risk factors for diabetes, and someone died from diabetes last week, there is no way for them to be included into my study, right? They're excluded from my study because they've died, which can introduce a bias because I'm only studying people who have survived to be included. There's a selection bias. So we try to do random selection, but a lot of times we cannot afford to go to all villages in a place, so we might choose urban areas because it's easier to get to. It can be very expensive. So I don't know how much the DHS is in Rwanda, but in other countries it's 3 million, 4 million US dollars. It can be a very expensive process to do a cross-sectional study. And then finally, because I don't know the time sequence, I cannot say something causes something. All I can say is there is a relationship. So this is the final summary of the 3 observational studies that we've looked at so far. So we have cohort studies, case control studies, and cross-sectional studies. And again, this should give you a good idea of what options are available to you if you want to look at something without doing an intervention. So a lot of times people ask me the question, I really want to study this. Which study design should I use? And I usually start with, is it a rare outcome? And if they say yes, then really the only option I have for rare outcomes is a case control study. If I want to look at risk factors for ovarian cancer, if I do a cross-sectional study, I will not find enough women with ovarian cancer to be able to ask the question. So if I say, is it a rare outcome, and they say yes, then I'm here. That's my only option in an observational study. My second question is it a rare exposure? Are the things that you're interested in causing that outcome, do they happen very often? And if they say yes, I only have one option. Okay, I'm here. If it is not a rare outcome or a rare exposure, you really can use any of them. And then other factors come into play. Do you want to look at multiple outcomes? Do you want to look at multiple exposures? Do you want to estimate prevalence? So these are all things you can consider. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. It just depends on the situation.